Hi, thank you for coming this evening. It's great to see so many people here, and especially so many alum faces. So if the alums, can you raise your hands? Alums are representing tonight. We're having sort of a quasi-homecoming event as part of this. So if you see somebody with a name tag on, they're probably an alum, and you can feel free to say hello. Warm welcome to the SVA Department of Design Research, Writing, and Criticism. My name is Molly Heinz, and I'm the program chair. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I am also an alum, proud to be. And you're here tonight to hear a lecture from some esteemed alums as well, Aileen Kwun and Bryn Smith, that's highlighted. And I really would love to see you all back here for the rest of our series this fall. We've got some great people lined up, and we'll be having our open house event on a Tuesday evening as well, November 15th. So if you or anyone you know might be interested in the program, I would encourage you to attend that as well. We also will start having our working lunch series, which is a very informal midday get-together where someone professional comes in and talks about their work practice. So if you're on our mailing list, you'll see notices about those as well. Usually they are around lunchtime, 12:30, 1 o'clock, and last for an hour. I would also like to introduce the person leaning in the doorway is David Knowles. David is our brand new Director of Operations. He is picking up the baton from our beloved Emily Weiner, who has moved on to be on the faculty at SVA, but still is in our midst, so she's really just working right across the street, which is comforting, and so you might see her around as well. But David comes to us from being the director of P Gallery downtown in Chinatown, and knows our design scene pretty well. He's actually trained as a graphic designer himself, and is also a DJ. So welcome, David. And David was very involved and instrumental in producing tonight's event, and also helping us keep the department looking great. You'll notice we have some new plant life here, David's touch. And I also want to introduce you to our 9 master's candidates, class of 2017. So Derek, Alex, Olivia, Emma, Paul, Joseph, or Joe, Carissa, Jiwon, and Molly. They are working hard right now in multiple courses and getting their thesis question refined and tuned, and they are on track to complete their degree in May. So they're with us for a short time, and then will be our latest alums. But they are also wearing name tags tonight, so please say hello. So I usually, as part of this introduction, just give a brief overview of the program for people who aren't familiar with it, and we're starting a little late, so I won't spend too long on it, but this is a one-year program, actually 9 months in 2 semesters. We have significant scholarships that are given by SVA to help defray tuition, and then we also have some merit-based scholarships that I'll talk about in 1 second. We do a lot of site visits, so getting outside the walls of the department quite a bit. We have a lot of guest lecturers, in addition to our Tuesday series lecturers that come to our classrooms. We have lots of assignments and one big fat assignment, which is the thesis. And all along the way, a lot of readings, as our current students can attest. I do have one exciting announcement related to our scholarships. We have a new scholarship just put into place by another alum, Susan Merritt, who is the class of 2015. And she has given funds towards an award, really, for application of thesis research. So we have something that's part of our thesis portfolio called the applied thesis, which is a proposal for how one's thesis work might live out in the real world, so to speak. So beyond what you write for your thesis paper and portfolio, how could your thesis concept manifest itself? So Susan has given us a gift of $500 towards the best applied thesis research proposal for this coming year. So thank you, Susan. Yeah. And a big thank you again to Maria Popova, Monotype, and Stephen Heller. with Susan's gift altogether, we have an additional $11,000 of merit-based scholarships to award throughout this year. In addition to that, we're continuing our work with the Van Allen Institute, and we're very excited about that. If you're not familiar with the Van Allen, they are a nonprofit that is actually just down the street on 22nd Street, and they are a research-focused operation that also leads competitions related to architecture and the urban environment. And we are working with them on a specific project called Van Allen Sessions in conjunction with the Atlantic magazine. Last spring, we had 2 students that were working on this project and helping research, interview, write what is essentially a video-based series about topics related to the urban environment and specifically infrastructure. So this fall, we have our new students, Derek Bengal and Molly Woodward, as our Van Allen Fellows, and it's a nice fellowship. You get real work, you get a byline on the Atlantic, and you also get paid. So congratulations, Derek and Molly. Yeah. And just to go back to our little overview, I'm going to give you a little bit more of a breakdown of our assignments in case you haven't seen this before. This is what goes down here day to day, hour to hour, the types of assignments that our instructors give out and the types of skills that we're trying to hone with the students. And if you come back next week and the weeks after, you'll see I'll highlight kind of what's center stage on any given week. Right now, everything's a bit in play. We've only been in class for a few weeks now, but I know narrative profiles are being worked on in Robin Pogrebin's class, and I think some op-eds in Carrie's class. Which brings me to our faculty. We have Carrie Jacobs here with us tonight, one of our very esteemed longtime faculty members. I will also give a nod to Ralph Caplan, who is one of our distinguished alum faculty members. He was teaching with us for several years when the program was an MFA Design Criticism program, and he is also part of Bryn and Eileen's book, so they'll speak to that as well. So glad you're here, Ralph. And his wife, Judith, is our special guest. But this is a quick overview of our faculty, leaders in their field of design journalism. And if you'd like to know more about our faculty, please visit our website. I also wanted to announce that Phil Patton, who was a late faculty member who passed away about a year ago, was a important person to us here in the department, and we have started celebrating him by having an annual lecture in his honor every spring. So stay tuned for the next annual Phil Patton lecture in March. And I'm showing right here collected works of Phil Patton that was produced by the Cooper Hewitt and as part of a memorial for him in March as well. The designer of that book happens to be here, Neil Donnelly. So good to see you, Neil. And we are also the proud recipients of Phil Patton's coffee cup lid collection, which we are going to turn into a nice display here in the department. But exciting news, we've also been the recipient of Phil Patton's entire archive. So right next door, we have many bankers' boxes of Phil Patton's unpublished work. And so we are going to be working with the archivist here at SVA to develop a finding aid and actually make that a usable resource for students to come. Also, a shout out to Chi Perlman, who great friend of the program, former editor of ID Magazine, and she has given us a collection of her archival IDs. So we have some of those to peruse through as well. And here's one example. And just a quick note, if you find all this intriguing, you may be interested in applying or know someone who is. It's a pretty simple process of transcripts, a letter of recommendation, a written statement of intent, a writing sample, and a resume. And that's it. You can find out more about the program on our website and see some of the graduated students' thesis work along with some other current work. And to talk to all of us more, I invite you back to the studio space where we work every day for more food and drinks after this fabulous, I'm sure, lecture. So, without further ado, Aileen Kwun and Bryn Smith are featured guests this evening. They are authors, and as I mentioned, they're alums, and they have just released this new book, 20 over 80, published by Princeton Architectural Press. And just a little background on Aileen and Bryn. Aileen is currently a senior editor at Dwell magazine, and she focuses her writing on art, architecture, and design, and the writing has appeared internationally in publications including the Architect's Newspaper, Detail, Designo, Domus, Graphic, Icon, among others. And she's received awards for her writing, which is actually kind of rare today, from Core 77 and AIGA Winter House. Aileen is an alumna of UC Berkeley and the Columbia School of Journalism's publishing program, but I'm proud to say that her last stop was SVA, so we can claim her. Aileen is an alum of the program in its 2-year iteration, the MFA in Design Criticism, and after she graduated in 2011, she worked for Project Projects, the multidisciplinary design studio here in New York, and she was previously on the editorial staffs of Metropolis and Surface, where she profiled legendary design figures such as Phyllis Lambert, Arthur Elgort, and Iris Epfel. And I'm also proud to say that Aileen is a co-founder of Superscript, the editorial design consultancy, of which I'm also a member. And Bryn is a graphic designer, writer, and critic. She is currently working on the editorial team at Google Design. She is co-editor of Design for People, stories about how and why we can all work together to make things better, which is published by Metropolis Books this year. So Bryn has 2 books published this year, which is pretty impressive. Bryn studied journalism and new media at the University of Colorado before starting her own multidisciplinary practice in 2002. And like Aileen, she received her MFA in Design Criticism from the School of Visual Arts. She graduated in 2013. Bryn currently writes about design and visual culture for Core 77, AIGA Ion Design, among other publications. And she was the project director for the recently launched Seymour Chwast archive. And Bryn also is teaching in the graphic design program at RISD. So, busy ladies. So I will turn it over to Aileen and Bryn for the next 45 minutes to an hour. We'll do some Q&A after, including some questions from the audience, and then continue with our reception. So please come up.
So yeah, as we said, we're both alum of the Decrypt program and met through the program. So we're very excited to share this book with you, in which we were able to use our findings and learnings from this course and apply them pretty directly to this book project. So today we're going to take you a bit behind the process of putting it together, which is a very long 3-year journey. In case you haven't seen the book yet, we had a video here of a flip through, but I think it might pose more trouble than it's worth. So I'm going to pass this copy around instead. And you can flip through it.
We forgot
IRL.
everything we learned here and decided to try a new form of presentation
Yes.
tonight.
Google Slides. So just to start with some background info on how the project first began. So our publisher, Princeton Architectural Press, was actually my first job out of college and what I was doing most immediately before coming to Decrypt. And a few years after finishing the MFA, the book idea was kind of mentioned to me in late 2012, early 2013, which sounds like ages ago. But at that point, it was really just a kernel of an idea. Kevin Lippert, the publisher of PAP, and Michael Carabetta, the creative director at Chronicle Books, had a vague notion of an idea to publish a book on 20 iconic design figures over the age of 80. And this was kind of a special project for PAP. They don't ordinarily develop or write titles in-house. With their specialized backlist of titles, they kind of have the good fortune of having many firms and authors approach them with completed manuscripts. So when they were looking for a writer to take it on, I was lucky to have an old friend and coworker, Paul Wagner, who is now the design director, ended up designing the beautiful book for us, suggested I might be up for it. He was right. Obviously, this is kind of a dream project to get, and the answer was a total no-brainer. Just thinking immediately about the figures that this age bracket included, the dream list started to compile pretty quickly, but getting the book started took a bit longer. The logistics ironed out in the next several months, and in that time, Bryn and I got to know each other a bit better at an AIGA conference where we were both speaking about our decrit theses, which is very nerdy connection, I know, and thought it would be great to work with her on the project, which we finally kicked off in 2013. So yes, things move quite slowly in the book world, but we'll come back to that in a bit. So the title and organizing principle of the book is a play on the common lists that highlight, the next up-and-comers. So you have Prince, 15 under 30, 80 art directors clubs, Young Guns, the New Yorkers, 20 over 40. The list really goes on and on. And on. As in this example, 20 under 1, which of course was a joke, but you get the idea about how common these lists become and kind of the fatigue that can set in trying to stay on top of all of them. So for a long time, 20 over 80 was pretty much our whole brief that we received from PAP and all we had to go on, which was actually really exciting for us to have that freedom and the carte blanche to really develop the format, who would be on the list, what kind of questions we would ask, how it would be organized, and then the fun part, tracking down all the images. And we ended up, even though they asked us to write the book, we ended up forming a proposal, just going through all the formal motions, even after we had been signed on to it. So this is how Michael Carabetta characterizes the focus of the book in our foreword. We give him and Kevin Liebert full credit for the idea, though we'll happily take credit for its execution. He says, the book's central intention is to celebrate the legacies of our greatest, oldest architects, designers, and thinkers have given the world. And I think that really sums up the book quite nicely. But aside from being, very catchy and readily apparent, the title 20 over 80 started to take on new meaning pretty quickly as soon as we began digging into the interviews. We started with Jane Thompson and Ralph Caplan, who's here with us tonight, and two people who we had. Give it up for Ralph. So we started with Jane Thompson and Ralph, two people who we had thankfully direct access to. Jane had lectured at Decrit before, and one of our teachers, Alexandra Ling, had just worked with her on Design Research, a book about the influential design store she ran with her late husband, Ben Thompson. And when we met with Jane at her studio in Cambridge, and one of the things she asked us jokingly was, "Oh, so this is a new list about submerging talent instead of emerging talent." Suffice to say, she had a great and sassy sense of humor, and we miss her dearly. And then, of course, the esteemed design writer Ralph Caplan, who's in the audience, was one of our dear teachers here. And when we met with Ralph, one of the first things he asked us when we described the book's premise to him was, "Did you intentionally allude to the 80 over 20 rule?" We weren't, but he was referring to the Pareto principle, which is an economic study positing that there's a small but powerful 20% of just about any population. Or put another way, a theory that says 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. Now, we're hardly economists here, but while the idea, otherwise known as law of the vital few, hadn't played a direct role in our approach initially, the thought did pose a very intriguing tie-in. We don't have a scientific or numeric basis to it, but it stuck as an analogy about the great and enduring influence coming from this small but mighty group. And that strength of influence became more and more clear to us as our interviews progressed with these legendary figures.
So here you have the 20 that we interviewed for the book. So this was quite a list, an exciting list for us, and really kind of surreal as we began interviewing each of these 20 legends. And we also had sort of a sense of urgency too. We really kind of took on the project in terms of wanting to carefully document these histories and thought of it as kind of a responsibility in terms of what we had studied and what we wanted to do with the book. And to break it down a little bit, you can see we wanted to include a real range of practitioners. Of course, we did end up with quite a few graphic designers, but also writers and critics, a lighting designer, furniture designer, illustrator, textile designer, We'll get into this a little bit later, but often the figures that we interviewed were very hard to sort of put a title to. They often had multiple jobs and over the course of their careers. Architects were also very well represented, strong majority. And of course, multiple titles, as I mentioned, or someone like Jane Thompson, who was an editor, a planner, a designer, and an educator, although she liked to call herself an architect without a portfolio. We were really keen to include as many women as possible. We got 6. We wanted to have more. We worked very hard to include as many as we could, and we'll talk a little bit later about how that played out. So it wasn't an ideal ratio, but we were really happy to include the 6 that we did. And part of our focus was really kind of, revisiting and reflecting on key moments from contemporary design history, straight from the people who were there. So we're really excited to share these sort of firsthand accounts in a format that was accessible to people who were interested in design or knew about design, but also people beyond, so people who maybe were coming to this book without prior knowledge of these figures.
So in the spirit of the book's organizing structure, we thought it would be fun to share a list of 10 lessons we learned along the way. Of course, there were many more, but this is kind of our top 10 from 20 over 80, if you will. So as Bryn said, fitting 20 huge legends into a single book was a task we felt great responsibility for. In many ways, we feel as though we've barely scratched the surface. Each one could easily be the subject of a giant monograph, and many are. But serving a set sample of this generation proved to be a really important learning exercise in itself. This was also the first book project either of us had tackled, so there was a lot of opportunity for learning.
A lot.
Actually, Bryn started and finished the second book in the process. So even though that one finished first, we'll count this one as her first. So the first point is that the design world, you think it's tiny now, but it was really, really tiny then. This was something that became very apparent to us early on, as certain cities and circles of people tended to kind of congregate around pretty distinct epicenters. New York, obviously, London, Milan, but we also included a few folks from Chicago, Montreal, Philadelphia. All in all, they mostly are from America, though we do have a few international figures as well. Really a rich tapestry of interrelated persons, events, moments, and we're just going to trace one thread here.
So this will kind of demonstrate how closely related everyone is in the book, and we're sort of calling this section 6 Degrees of Jane Thompson. But we could really do this with anyone in the book, so we'll kind of walk through Jane's biography and try to connect her to as many people as we can. So Jane graduated from Vassar and headed straight to MoMA in the 1950s and started working in the secretarial pool there. One day she was asked to take a letter for Philip Johnson, and by taking that letter she quickly secured a job in the then nascent architecture and design department, which was led by Philip Johnson. Also working at MoMA in the time was assistant curator Ada Louise Huxtable, who later became architecture critic and one of our heroes here at DCRIT, or the department formerly known as DCRIT. And while Ada left for a Fulbright scholarship abroad, Jane took her place as assistant curator in the architecture department. So there were a lot of folks crossing paths there, Alfred Barr, of course, as well. And Jane really referred to this time, her time at MoMA, as her graduate education. So she said to be a fly on the wall there and see everything that was happening, everybody who came and went, the exhibitions that were being made, it was an absolutely great education, and really sowed the seeds for her of her lifelong advocacy, which was to promote design as a way of thinking, working, and living. And if we stay with Philip Johnson for a moment, in the early 1950s, he and Mies van der Rohe were hired as architects to build and design the Seagram building. Mies was the lead of this project, and Johnson was a key partner in charge of interiors. And they were hired by someone else who's in our book, Phyllis Lambert. And this is how we get from Jane to Phyllis. At the age of 27, Phyllis became the director of planning for the building, and it was integral in hiring both Johnson and Mies, and in making this project, which we all kind of know now, its history as a real modernist masterpiece. So years later, we've skipped a lot of Jane's biography. There's plenty more. She was working at Interiors, and the publisher, Charles Whitney, came to her to start a new magazine called Industrial Design, later called ID Magazine, which we just saw the archive of at the beginning of a presentation. He said the time has come for industrial design and asked Jane to become the editor. So this was 4 to 5 years after the war. Factories were turning out cars and refrigerators. Things were being made of chrome, and there was a lot to write about in terms of the industrial design. So Jane signed on as founding editor, and one of her first hires was poet Ralph Caplan. So Ralph, as we've mentioned many times, was a beloved teacher of ours and is one of the 20 in the book. There were also other folks who were working at industrial design. Alvin Lustig was the art director. George Nelson was a contributing editor and often a presence, as he had an office just upstairs from the ID offices, and he became a friend to both Jane and Rolf and a frequent contributor and consultant for the magazine. And famously, Andy Warhol, who Jane hired as a young art student to design a spread for ID on tractors. Rolf later worked with Charles and Ray Eames at the Eames office, whose work he had gotten to know a bit when he was at ID. Charles called to ask if he would work on the IBM pavilion for the 1964 World's Fair. And a quote from the book, Rolf said, he said he really needed a writer, and I was fascinated by the idea.
I hope you don't fact check us on this, Ralph.
Deborah Sussman, another of our 20, worked at the Eames office as a young woman, befriending both Charles and Ray and often spending time with them outside of work. Deborah gets us easily to industrial designer Richard Sapper, whom she met in the late 1950s when they were both working in Milan, sort of in the midst of the Italian design renaissance. She was working at the infamous Studio Bulgari. They became lifelong friends. And Richard Sapper and the designer and illustrator Lora Lamm, another of our 20, worked together at the Milanese department store La Rinascente. This was a really forward-thinking store that was responsible for starting Italy's premier award for industrial design. So that is just but one thread that we followed, but we really could do this with almost anyone in the book.
Right, one thread from one moment in time, because as we know, all of them have lived many lives and had many wide-ranging chapters to their career, crossing mediums, cities, everything like that. And that was one thread that really, unites all of these diverse figures, is that sense of resiliency and constant reinvention in their work and what they're known for. These figures really do defy categorization, spanning multiple mediums, careers, with a fearlessness to take on the unfamiliar. Given the fixed age bracket, they also lived through some very trying times. Many of them were raised during the Great Depression, lived through World War II, saw industrial design explode in the post-war period. Beverly Willis, who's one of our interviewees, grew up during that time period, obviously, and worked in oil fields as a kid in Kansas, and sums up the time like this. She says, the era in which I was born gave me a fearlessness and to some degree an aggressiveness that came from being instilled with the idea that you might have to fight for your life. They wanted us as individuals to be equipped, not necessarily to fight the enemy, but to survive. And I think all of them have this sense of resiliency in different ways. Riccardo Scofidio, principal of Diller, Scofidio and Renfro, who's the youngest one in our book, nearly left the architectural field altogether in the 1970s, then came back. And he says of this time, it was an in-between stage like treading water. It was during that period that I realized I didn't have to practice architecture the way the profession practiced it. When he came back and began working with Elizabeth Diller, his current partner, he came back stronger than ever, delving into an experimental practice encompassing art, performance, and expanding the definition of architecture in the process. And many of them have traveled and lived in all sorts of cities. Deborah Sussman, as Bryn just mentioned, as well as Jacqueline Ware Larson, who was a diplomat and traveled the world through all sorts of different roles and titles. So just to provide a visual illustration of the trajectory of Bob Will, who strikes us as particularly freewheeling. while he was young in his 20s and getting his start in New York as a freelance illustrator, shortly after having drawn his first magazine cover for Interiors, again, another recurring presence that we picked up on, he left for London on vacation on a whim in 1960. And though he was just there for a holiday, he ended up staying there for 15 years. In that process, forming Fletcher, Forbes, and Gill, shown here in 1962. And as we all know now, that firm was kind of the predecessor for Pentagram today. And during that time, they published a book on visual culture, right here, called Graphic Design Visual Comparisons. And this book sold over 100,000 copies when it came out, which was really unheard of for a design book at the time, if you can imagine. I don't think we'll get to 100,000. When he finally returned to New York 15 years later in 1975, he co-writes and produces a Broadway musical about the Beatles called Beatlemania. And he also curiously directed a porn called The Double Exposure of Holly, which, don't worry, we don't have a picture of, nor did we try to track down. And he's worked here and lived in New York entirely solo and freelance ever since, prefers to work completely independently, and has written over more than a dozen books along the way. And he's a fan of 20 over 80, which is saying a lot because he's a tough critic. So here's Bob earlier this year with a finished copy in his hand.
All right, so number 3, persistence pays off. So after all the interviews were finished, edited, finalized, we then were confronted with image rights and figuring out how we were going to kind of put this book together. I think there were 250 images that we had to track down, and we were really working with a limited budget, so there was a lot of begging and borrowing and pleading with our subjects to provide us with great images, which they did, and then we could fact check and confirm. But like any process, it really wasn't easy, and this was one of the, I think, the biggest challenges for us in the book. So for example, for Jens Risom's profile, we became really obsessed with tracking down and reprinting this infamous image from a 1961 spread in Playboy. So the article was called Designs for Living. As you can see, it features George Nelson, Edward Wormley, Errol Saarinen, Harry Bertoya, Charles Eames, and Jens Risom on the very right. So I think we had maybe even seen this when we were in school here, and it's a very iconic image, and we really wanted to print it in the book, but we didn't know how to get it. So there was a bit of tracking down that had to happen. So I tried this approach. We sent out a tweet asking if anyone knew who had the rights to this image, even who the photographer was, because we couldn't, the image we had, we couldn't tell who the photographer was credited, so we were kind of stuck. And so I ended up in sort of an odd moment that I didn't think the book was going to take me to the Playboy customer service email, but here we are. So I talked to or emailed with a very helpful customer service rep there, who told me, of course, that this was from a 1961 image. That much we knew. And they didn't know who owned the copyright, but they did tell me that the photographer was Marvin Kohner. So from there, I was able to track down Marvin Kohner's estate and speak with his daughter, Pam. And we sort of ran into a similar issue there, where then Pam had to go back and check, because she wasn't sure who had the copyright. But luckily, she determined that they did hold the copyright. She had an image for us. This is the watermarked image, but it was really lovely that we were able to get this image and include it in the book. And even fun to sort of see the uncropped raw photo as well, just to see kind of the detail and imagine these figures all sitting together for this photo shoot. And one of the challenges, particularly with this profile in the book, was that our interview was very short. Jens, who just turned 100 this year, we didn't have a lot of time with him, so it was kind of a short interview. We really wanted to punctuate it with really wonderful imagery and rich imagery. So we had the previous image that I just talked about, and then we also had this image by Richard Avedon that we also wanted to include. So this was a series of ads that was done for Jens Risom's furniture company in the 1950s, and the tagline was "The answer is Risom." But again, we were sort of faced with, we probably can't reprint this image. We reached out to the Avedon Foundation, and they told us their fee for using it in the interior of the book was $1,500, which was more than our entire budget for imagery for the book, plus production costs, scanning, retouching, anything like that. And the woman I corresponded with there was extremely helpful, and she was able to find some details about the image, that it was, the model was Mary Jane Russell. She had sat for Avedon on December 22nd, 1954, but they didn't even have any negatives or prints. So even if we wanted to use this image, we couldn't even get it from them. But she did tip us off to the fact that another option would be to reproduce the ad as it originally appeared. So we could locate a tear sheet from an original publication, and then it would only cost us $250. So we went that route.
Still a huge chunk of our budget, but
Yeah.
this was one of the few that we really thought was important to include.
So we had a little tracking down to do. We ended up getting an image off of eBay for $10, scanning it this was from an issue of Interiors as well. But the resolution wasn't great, and we were having some issues with it. So then we had to reach out to Zachary Sachs, another former alum, over at the Milton Glaser archives in the Heller collection, and he was able to find an image and scan it for us. And then Paul Wagner, our designer, was able to tweak it and make it look better. So this is the final image as it appeared in the book.
Yes, so persistence pays off, although sometimes it doesn't in the case of one of our interviewees. So just a funny sidebar from interviewing Bob Gill. While we were speaking with him, he pitched us to design the cover of our book more than once. As mentioned, we didn't have a budget, so unfortunately we couldn't hire him. We also thought it might provide a weird bias, but we give him a lot of points for trying.
Okay, so number 4, there's no such thing as a basic question. So this was something else we learned here in the Art of the Interview course, that a simply phrased question can sometimes be really effective and more effective than a really pointed, complex question. So we often wish during the process that we had used the same set of questions for everyone, although we didn't, because the researchers and us really wanted to ask specific things and really get into it. So we did a lot of research beforehand so that we could allow for kind of conversation to unfold naturally, candid moments, and then also specific questions. But it was really important to us that it wasn't, just a questionnaire or a survey, but really a conversation. So some of the things we gravitated towards were, what advice would you give yourself at the beginning of your career? What were your biggest setbacks and your greatest triumphs? And the most obvious question was really one of, I think in the end, our most favorite, which was simply, when did you first discover design? So really a simple question, but there was a lot of similarity in formative childhood experiences from our interviewees. Seymour Chwast, Alessandro Mendini, and Michael Graves all mentioned Disney characters. Seymour Chwast recalled that he became interested in drawing when he first saw Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So the year was 1937. He thought he wanted to become an animator, and then he was sure he wanted to become an animator after he saw Pinocchio. So this was really interesting, from Milan to New York. Architect, theorist Alessandro Mendini, he later became a significant figure in the Italian radical design movement, but he also had the same kind of experience with Disney. Many people also mentioned Saul Steinberg. Some were simply drawn to drawing. Swiss designer, illustrator Lora Lamm drew slate portraits of Shirley Temple, Santa Claus, and Easter Bunny for her classmates. And to this day, Milton says the pencil is still his favorite piece of technology. But really, a wide range of interests. Jane Thompson had studied dance, and as an 18-year-old, her dance teacher took her to Manhattan to see Martha Graham's Letter to the World, which really had a profound effect on her. Phyllis Lambert discovered sculpture when she had the mumps, and the nurse who was taking care of her had a brother who did art lessons. So really getting the mumps allowed her to connect with this woman who saw her talent because she was making a bunch of things out of plasticine. And her nurse said, "This child takes the sculpture like a fish to water. Can I introduce you to my brother-in-law who teaches art, and so she was sort of set on that path. For Ralph, humor writing and performing as a stand-up comic was one of his early introductions to design. Playing music, fixing up cars for Ricardo Scafidio, or being a teen solo pilot in the case of Beverly Willis. So things have changed. The design world has gotten bigger in some sense, but this sort of suggests that there's no singular way to success. And then, sometimes we also asked questions in a bit of a provocation. So do you think there's a distinction between art and design? Of course, there's a shifting definition and how one defines, their position in the field can really be revealing, kind of illuminating this kind of cyclical narratives like art versus design, but also kind of reframing those conversations for a new audience. So sometimes if you ask a kind of staid question in a creative way, you might get a refreshing answer as well.
Right, which brings us to our next lesson, which is that it's all about perspective. So putting together all these interviews, we were really struck by the simultaneity of certain historic threads. When you think of mid-century Manhattan, you think of the MoMA, the row of skyscrapers going up on Park Avenue, the Seagram building. It all kind of paints a neat and coordinated picture. But in fact, wildly different movements were happening elsewhere, sometimes in the same place, at the same time. So one of the really big lessons we learned is that history doesn't unfold in chapters that finish and begin with neat endings and beginnings, but rather kind of chaotically all at once. And it's really in the role of the researchers and the critics to kind of sort that out, parcel them out in such a way that sheds new perspectives, new contexts. Jack Lenore Larson had a great quote about how history can be a projection by younger generations, one that's not entirely true, maybe a blend of fiction and borrowed nostalgia. He says, young people are constantly inventing the mid-century, imagining how things were. They're creative and tell it the way they imagine it to be, which is often wrong. So thinking about things in constellations of time was a really interesting exercise again. One of the sections in the book that we found was really important, but kind of got to towards the end, was the section of chronologies that are in the back of the book, which are essentially abbreviated timelines of major moments in each of these figures' lives. And that kind of started as a logistics solution to the fact that we couldn't reference or cover all of these key moments in the profiles and the introductions themselves. So we were still limited by room in the end in terms of how exhaustive those chronologies were in the book. It ended up being really illuminating to see all these kind of key moments together and compare them side by side. So just to think about a single 5-year span in the early 1970s, Ralph was a board member at the International Design Conference in Aspen. Alessandro Mendini was creating really radical protests in Italy. Pushpin Studios had their first solo show at the Louvre, which was the first major exhibition on a single design studio. The New York Five published their first book. Richard Hollis designed Ways of Seeing, which was a print edition of John Berger's highly acclaimed BBC television series. And Ingo Maurer was traveling throughout Japan, studying, traditional fan making and hanging out with Isamu Noguchi. So just thinking about all those things happening in the same time, I think was a big eye-opener. And the majority of our interviews didn't like being boxed into a specific style or genre. So, though in textbooks we read about the modernism movement and the postmodernism movement happening kind of separately, was obviously much more fluid than that. And many of them had too many chapters in their lives to even define themselves to any one, specific body of work. So we love this quote from Deborah Sussman, who started her design career working with the Eames office, and then, of course, went on to pioneer super graphics, whole architectural spaces, the kind of whole very energetic, colorful look of California New Wave in the 80s. And she had this great quote when I asked her, do you identify as a modernist? That was a leading question because I knew she would have a great answer for it. And she said, one of my greatest mentors used to say, ism is equated to thinking small. I don't like to be part of an ism, and I don't think it's so easy to characterize the work with a word like that. when you're working in the middle of something, you don't discuss it as much or label it. You just do it. I think that really resonated with us and reminded us that history is, can sometimes be an approximation at best based on the memory and experience of what can be found or traced back based on what materials are available. And a big reason why we saw, kind of ourselves as lifelong students of design, really approaching this book as a collection of oral histories.
Okay, number 6, go beyond the myth. So this was something we confronted a lot because our interviewees had been interviewed a lot and had kind of crystallized anecdotes sometimes or projects that people had heard about a lot. So we started thinking about, how do you get a new angle on on an old story, or do you? But we kind of made a point to not shy away from sharing these familiar stories. We didn't kind of want to alienate readers by excluding these stories. And we also found there's kind of importance in the persistent details, the things that get retold as they sort of pass from first telling to near myth or then even to legend.
Right, so kind of, exploring that notion of the tradition of oral storytelling. Even if a familiar story is retold, our understanding of that story really changes based on when we hear it, right? So as we were sitting with Milton Glaser, hearing about the genesis of the I Heart New York logo, which we all know, sitting at the table where he drew it up and really conceived of it, has continually new meaning, though we've all heard the story. So we realized that over the years, a design, object, or story accrues meaning based on how you've known it, how your subject has known it, how its place in culture has evolved, and the point in time in which you take in all that information. So, whether you are familiar with the napkin sketch that Milton first came up with the idea with, whether it incites visions of tourist souvenirs in Times Square, or this most recent iteration, which Milton created in the wake of 9/11 as a way of renewing love for the city. The logo has remained both the same and different, in that myths accumulate and collect extra meaning along the way. So it's kind of the idea of parallax, if you were to think about it, translated to time. So in that way, there's never an old story or a fixed account of what or how something is, only ways of telling it in that given moment. And so we did include a fair amount of iconic imagery throughout the book, including this photo of Denise Scott Brown in Las Vegas, as taken by Robert Venturi in 1966, and then, of course, made famous in their study Learning from Las Vegas. Anyone interested in architecture will recognize this photo, but we think, seeing it alongside lesser-known images, personal snapshots of her travels, archival photos, things from our interviewees' personal collections, gives it a new context. So in Denise's case, that meant her trove of travel photos and an image of the childhood home she grew up in, which is a really stark international style home in Johannesburg, South Africa. So just seeing, thinking about this image within that context of a larger body of images that we aren't familiar with was really interesting. And she's actually working on a book right now about her photography over the years. And then, of course, there were brilliant golden moments like this, etched into history through photographic evidence. This is Stanley Tigerman playing a match of tennis with Richard Meyer, Charles Gwathmey, and Peter Eisenman in 1979 in Florida, and on page 196 of our book. So here, again, this was just kind of, the personal snapshots that interviewees shared with us, which may have been mundane or everyday in the moment, but in retrospect is pretty amazing to think of these guys playing a game of tennis together. So returning back to our earlier point about trying to include as many women as possible, obviously we couldn't invent women out of thin air, but the female experience is one we definitely wanted to capture among the 6 interviewees that we did confirm, which is, again, far from an equal amount, but one we feel really fortunate to have included. All of them extremely fierce women. Just opening with this quote from Phyllis Lambert, who, as Bryn said, at the age of 25 was really helming and directing the Seagram building project. Working against gender bias, a very heavily male-dominated field, and at the age of 27 with little professional experience, but unwavering sense of conviction. We asked her, was it daunting when you took that project on? How did you kind of build up the confidence, given all the adversity you were working against? And she says, I never thought of confidence. I just did what had to be done. How ridiculous not to. It was impossible not to do the very best I could. It wasn't a job. I didn't consider it that way. It was just a part of civilization, something that had to happen. And of course, this is the famous letter that started it all. Phyllis was living abroad in Paris when she was 26, pursuing life as an artist, continuing along with the sculpture that her nurse had discovered in her. So when she got wind of her father's plan to build a new skyscraper on Park Ave with an architect she strongly disliked, she promptly wrote him a very persuasive letter convincing him otherwise. Just to illustrate the sense of gumption that she has, I'm just going to read a few lines from the opening. She writes, Dearest Daddy, received your letter when in London, and a day later found what you call the building, a plan of the building. To find a plan of a building rather surprised me, as I thought you were going to have a consultant first and then go about choosing an architect. Well, now I will set about writing the letter about which I have been thinking for a few days, and this letter starts with one word repeated very emphatically. No, 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 no. It's a good letter, and convinced her father that to allow her to take the reins on the project. So she moved back to New York to conduct the search for a new architect, one that could express the progressive values of the modernist era which she believed in, and assumed the position of director of planning. Again, purely through words and conviction, and a belief of what design at that moment should embody. So she landed on Mies van der Rohe and Johnson for the interiors. Of course, helming a project of that scale was, absolutely huge in those days, one of the most expensive projects in that time period. And doing this all as a single woman in her mid-20s, often the only woman in the room. Just to share a bit about another pioneering woman in our book, Beverly Willis, came from very humble beginnings, grew up in rural Kansas, worked on oil rigs, became a solo pilot as a teen, started an arts atelier painting frescoes in Hawaii, then started an architecture firm in San Francisco. And later when she was commissioned to design a large housing community for military members returning from World War II, she also pioneered one of the first computer programs implemented for large-scale land use planning and analysis. And even today, in her late 80s, she's a huge proponent for design and tech working together. So like Phyllis, she recounts the daily political challenges of being a female business owner, a leader, managing her own firm, and again, being one of the few women around. When we asked her, how she kind of made it through all those challenges, she says, I never dwelled on it. As in anything I wanted to do in my life, when I could see a solid wall in front of me, I'd approach it with the mindset that I'd climb over and around it. Whatever I had to do to get on the other side, I could always figure out something. Here's a photo of her, our admirable lady boss, in 1982. And of course, being able to have Denise Scott Brown as part of the mix was a huge win for us. We absolutely felt her inclusion was necessary and also timely. So in 2013, while we were in the thick of this book, she reemerged as a figurehead for women in architecture when students from Harvard GSD started a viral petition to have her honored as part of Venturi's 1991 Pritzker Prize. So the petition was filed, of course, many years after the fact on behalf by students from Women in Design. And in their petition, which was online and went viral, got over 20,000 signatures. They demanded that she retroactively receive recognition for that prize. A simple gesture, but really a testament to her legacy, but also, the gender bias that still pervades, because ultimately the campaign did prove unsuccessful. In our interview, she reflects on moments which, despite being a creative equal with Rob Venturi, she was constantly belittled by peers in his shadow. Faced with such adversity, she said, If you like making things, then it's the making of things that keeps you in it, the gathering together. And she still remains ever optimistic today. When we asked her if she thought there was a brighter future for women in the field, her response was, "Isn't that moment now?" One of my triumphs now is this petition, which was really uplifting to hear. So obviously, while all of the figures in our book have made tremendous leaps in their fields, as fellow women in a still relatively male-dominated field, we find special inspiration by stories like these strong women. And can't stop, won't stop. Yes, so one of the main focus points was also to interview active, practicing designers working well into their 8th decade, partly because we quickly discovered that most of them were, just by chance, I suppose. And we were curious to hear how they had adapted to immense cultural, economic, and technological changes for over a 6-decade career and counting. Ironically, when we visited Jane Thompson in Cambridge, she had a few items pulled aside for us, including this 2002 book about retirement by Edgar Bronfman, who happens to be one of Phyllis Lambert's younger brothers. Of course, up until her passing earlier this August, Jane had no desire whatsoever to retire and stop working, which is pretty funny that she was profiled in this book. She was involved in long-term civic revitalization projects until the end, ran her own planning firm, and told us that she thought longevity proves something, and we certainly agree. And of course, Milton Glaser, like many of our interviewees, shared those same sentiments. One of his personal mantras, "Art is work," stenciled at the entrance of the front door to his studio. Though of course it follows, you should work in doing what you love. So nearly all of our interviews were not only active, but extremely busy, which made our pursuit all the more worthwhile. To get Denise Scott Brown confirmed, for example, I think it took at least 7 or 8 months of emailing back and forth with her before she caved and granted us a 1-hour phone interview, which ended up being closer to 2. And she did have a very valid reason, which was that she was racing to meet her own book deadlines. So it was very inspiring to hear that that motivation has never ended for a lot of them.
Another interviewee, Seymour Chwast, I don't think he's ever taken a day off or a weekend off in years. He paints on the weekends and kind of considers every day a new job, regardless of whether he's kind of on assignment or not. He just recently completed a Kickstarter campaign for a book, Seymour Chwast at War with War, which documents his nearly 75-year campaign to use his design and artwork to kind of protest the idea of war itself. And so for us, I think the ability by so many of them to know when to start something new, kind of when to move on, and ultimately what to invest in their careers was something that I think for us was really interesting. And as we're kind of starting out in our careers, we were really fascinated by how people move through their lives and their professional lives and careers, how they stay motivated and relevant, which is really not an easy thing to do. Mm-hmm. So just learning to kind of navigate difficult periods and transitions seemed like it is really a skill, and that we were hoping to kind of portray in the book. And it's really that no two careers look alike. There's a lot of different ways to do it. So number 9, this is going to take a while. So our hard advice here is that if you think about how long a book might take, you should probably multiply that by 3. We had the ambitious goal of completing the book in a year. I think part of why Aileen brought me onto the project was it was a lot of work, and she was like, "I need help. Let's do this together. We're going to knock it out." But we couldn't really make it faster. It just was a long process, and there were 20 people to interview and coordinate with, and all the photo research and everything else. Right. We were working a lot of different methods. Went to archives and libraries. Had a lot of documents circling back and forth, and also a lot of help from people in our interviewees' lives. So from studio managers and family members. I had mentioned Jens Risom, who we actually interviewed at his kind of retirement community in New Canaan, Connecticut. And so that interview was actually conducted kind of in a courtyard with his 2 daughters and his wife. And so it was almost a family affair of sitting down and kind of having this conversation and kind of translating questions and kind of all doing it together. So those moments were really lovely, but also kind of, added to the difficulty of the project in some sense.
Right. It was a very precarious balance between, getting it all together and doing it as quickly as possible, but also, as in much detail, with as much accuracy, with the best photos, and so it was a balance between speed and quality. So with that, we'd like to close with some of our favorite moments and bits of advice. We feel so thankful to have worked on this project, and we feel compelled to share these bits of wisdom with you and hope you'll pass them along. From Ralph Caplan on how to approach design. Use whatever resources are available to improve situations that need improving, because it's not always a problem, sometimes it's just a circumstance. From Milton Glaser, simply, do good work. A note on researching from Denise Scott Brown, which is relevant to all of us here. The research side has its own creativity too. You can be just as creative about analysis as you can about design, and you need both. Some practical advice from taking research to the next level from Richard Hollis. For editors, think always of the reader and not the designer. And to historians, just keep going. From Bob Gill, whose freelance career has seen many waves of economic inflation over the years. On proposing design fees, he passes on his wife's advice, which is to double it, always double it. From textile designer Jacqueline Orr Larson, who has traveled the world over, he says, the heart is a good reason. Some more practical advice from Seymour Chwast is, especially if you're freelance, is to save your money. Finally, from Ricardo Scafidio, which kind of ties all of these really rich narratives together. If there's a formula, I don't have it.
And then we wanted to do just kind of a short 20/80 by the numbers, highlighting a few choice moments. So our oldest interviewee was in fact Jens Risom, who turned 100 in May. Our youngest interviewee was Ricardo Scafidio. Actually, when we asked him to be in the book, he wasn't 80 yet, but we were like, "You're going to be 80 by the time we finish."
Yeah. Don't worry, the book's not going to come out in time.
So that goes back to it's going to take a long time. The longest interview we think was Jane Thompson. So this one clocked in. Eileen and I took the bus up to Boston one day, met Jane at her studio and talked with her for 3.5 hours. So this was also our first interview. It was a lovely conversation, but it was a bear to transcribe. And it took a lot of energy and a lot of time. And so we definitely reduced the length of interviews after that. We tried really hard to be a little bit more succinct and kind of control the interview a little bit more. In terms of kind of how we handled it. The shortest
transcript was like 18,000 words.
Very long.
And we narrowed it down to maybe 3. So good editorial exercise.
The shortest interview, I think, was Milton Glaser. It was maybe 30 minutes, and he had, of course, extremely insightful, wonderful things to say that barely needed any editing.
Yeah. That one is almost a straight transcript just because he spoke with this professorial air.
So as we mentioned, 6 women, 14 men, altogether a century of collective wisdom, 250 photo rights queries, 2 different cover options. We're very happy we landed with the one that we have. 3 editors, so again, took a long time. Editors turned over 224 pages, lots of information. This was the amount of email threads Aileen and I exchanged.
Threads, not total emails.
Yeah. Lots of nights and weekends. And 3 years later, we had this book, which was our first, as we mentioned. So just kind of coming back to the Pareto principle, which you mentioned at the beginning. This is really our toast to the vital few. Obviously, we feel so honored to be able to have written the book and kind of taken some of this to heart.
Right, and there's obviously so many other people in this age bracket that, it was a tough choice to land on our decisions, but there's so many more stories to share, so much more history to carve out, and so we hope this inspires you to go out there and do your own research. So, thank you.
First of all, thank you. That was an amazing story of your journey, which it's always interesting to hear how books get made. But I wanted to turn a couple of your own questions on you and ask you, if you could give yourself advice, like going back 3 years, having gone through all this, what would you say to yourself? You mentioned the Jane Thompson interview, which maybe was more unwieldy than you would have liked, but what else would you give yourself advice about?
I think in some sense it was a learning process in terms of trusting ourselves. I think we probably knew we couldn't have done it in a year. Like, there were a lot of things I think we had kind of gut feelings about, and even in kind of learning how to push back about certain things, like in the editorial process too, to really like have our own voice come through at times. I think that was a challenge.
I would just say, trying to do a thorough job from the beginning. I think, obviously, we received a lot of pressure to commit to a season for the book, and then, things happen with rights, image rights, and things like that. So really just, be honest and stick to your guns and just do as great of a job as you can, because at the end of the day, this book is going to exist out in the world. So, but yeah, we're so happy with the result, and I think 3 years was the amount of time we needed. So.
Aside from the, let's say, some of the prevailing themes that emerged, maybe unexpectedly, what was, for each of you, a big surprise during the process, or the biggest surprise?
I think just each of the interviews' sense of independence. For example, I know we've been sharing a lot of Jane anecdotes, but after our 3.5 hour conversation concluded, we were racing to take this final train back to New York, and she was like, "Oh, I can just give you a ride. Do you want to hop in my car?" And so, just seeing how independent and, on her own she was really inspiring. She ran her whole huge studio on her own, but yeah, so things like that, I think, were fun little anecdotes we remember.
Yeah, I think surprising just in terms of, I think this was something we learned when we were in school too, that oftentimes people are willing to talk to you and tell you their stories. You just have to ask. Sometimes you might be intimidated or think, you've heard, you read about people and you think they're a certain way. Phyllis Lambert was this example where I think we had read a lot about how she was very strong-willed, and a lot of it was just kind of in the retelling of like how she got this Seagram building built, and I think in some sense there was some hesitancy in approaching her, and how do we, doing an interview with someone who maybe is going to be combative, and she wasn't that way at all. She was extremely lovely and was happy to give us her time and talk through her stories, and so I think it was just a kind of a lesson in just asking people and getting them to kind of open up and share, and not kind of bringing your own baggage to it as well.
Just about not being afraid. I think putting out the ask is probably the scariest part, but in retrospect, it was probably the easiest. All of them more or less said yes. I think the only no's we received were either, they just stopped giving interviews, or, it wasn't, no one was combative or kind of uninterested. And yeah, they were just so generous and open, and, again, not being afraid to ask those very basic questions too, I think, teased out some of the more interesting quotable moments, so.
To take you back to your Decrit days for a moment, and Adam Harrison Levy, who teaches the Art of the Interview course here still, was sorry he couldn't be here tonight. I know he'd be bursting with pride over your project, but you had mentioned some, like, for example, that you'd learned in Adam's class there are no basic questions. And in reading some of these interviews, I was thinking of some other Adam pointers that maybe you brought to bear on this, and particularly with the Michael Graves interview, for example, where maybe you save some of the tougher questions for the end of the interview, and they got some pretty hot stuff there. So can you talk about the tone of some of the interviews?
Yeah, of course. So obviously going into the interviews, we tried to do as much research as possible, but it was also really important to not get bogged down by it in a sense. I think, these are figures that have been revered for years, and they're probably used to that kind of, being approached in that kind of manner. So I think for us, we really just tried to keep it as conversational as possible, as personable. I think one of the things Adam really taught us was establishing that initial rapport when you sit down with someone. Definitely hint at that you've done your research, but don't go straight in for that one controversial question or thing that you're, that's really esoteric and you're dying to know because you're a design geek or whatever. But starting with those really basic questions, showing that you've done the research but not in a heavy-handed way, I think really sets the tone for how much they're willing to share with you.
And I think there was a couple, not ground rules, but I think a couple ways that we approached people as well. I mean, if you read the book and you read the introductions, we kind of chose to shy away from the personal in a sense. Like, we don't talk about, in most cases, marriages and children and kind of really personal details. Sometimes those came up, but we decided to more focus on the professional. And I think, in terms of that Michael Graves interview, that was one of those moments that you live for as a.
Describe it a little bit.
Yeah, it was. So I took the train up to Princeton to meet with him, and one of the things Aileen and I had to do just by way of the many people we had to interview was we did a lot of the earlier interviews together, and then at a certain point we had to kind of divide and conquer. So this was one that I took on, and I went up and met with him in his studio. We sat at a table together, just he and I and the recorder. He was drinking coffee. It was really lovely, and we just kind of got into a conversation. And I had read a lot about him, knew a lot about how he had sort of this, become this symbol of postmodern. Like, you think postmodernism, you think Michael Graves, and that's what everyone goes to. And so it just sort of naturally came up at some point, and he got really angry and was like, I hate. He used a much stronger word. I hate being painted as a post-fucking modernist, is what he said. And it was just like a lovely moment. And I kind of pushed him and I said, well, why do you think that? And he kind of kept elaborating. It was just I haven't had a lot of moments like that in interviewing people, but you just could see that he really wanted to tell that story. And he was also really excited in the sense that he talked about how he used to have people come interview him all the time, and that had kind of died down, and he was struggling with that in the sense that his studio is still, even after his passing, thriving. It has an industrial design arm, it has an architecture arm, and they do projects all over the world. But people are just still stuck on, the Portland building, and that's what they know, and that's what they talk about. So just kind of getting to that moment and letting him run with it.
So recommended reading. So I'm going to turn the mic over to the audience for a few minutes. Does anybody have a question for Aileen and Bryn?
Did any of the designers, especially on top of Graves, mention having learned something, having had a new insight into design from being 80-something years old, such as not liking the Apple brick, which has the white-on-white lettering for the specs, which demands eyesight that's better than really anybody has, but especially when you're over 80, you don't have that eyesight, and there's no ergonomics to it. It slips out of your fingers, and did they ever, aside from Graves, mention reconsidering older designs because they wouldn't work for them as an older person?
Yeah, I think one sentiment that a lot of them shared was that each generation tackles its own problems, and that really definitely came across. But also, I think design education has flourished so much as well. So for them, it was interesting to hear about how each of them have foundations from across the arts and liberal arts and how they found their way into it. But then thinking about what the set of skills the next generation will have to learn in order to continue that. And And I would say Beverly Willis was one of the few that were very gung-ho about technology, but a lot of them had really interesting insights about how that has completely flipped around the industry they had known for 20 or 30 years, and kind of grappling with that. We mentioned how Milton Glaser cited the pencil as his favorite piece of technology. So I don't know if that answers your question, but does it? Or I don't know.
Is there anybody you wanted to interview but weren't able to due to scheduling issues or any sort of technical snafu that doesn't involve death?
Yeah, there were a few figures in Japan we were interested in including. A graphic designer, I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but Tadanori Yoku, who's kind of, I guess you could characterize him as a Japanese counterpart to the pushpin movement. He was actually, I think, 2 or 3 years shy of 80, and we were planning to complete the book by then, so that didn't work out. Another one was Arata Izozaki, part of the Japanese metabolism movement. He had just been profiled extensively by the Architectural Association, so he kind of didn't want to go through and revisit his whole career again. But also further along our correspondence, he said, I don't know if I identify with the title architect, or it was a very kind of philosophical thing that prevented him from doing it. I think Dieter Rams was confirmed at one point, but then he just had a huge monograph come out. So yeah, there was a push and pull. I think each time we had confirmed one interviewee, we would go back and reassess the list and see, okay, who can kind of complement each other or even this list out a bit more. So it was a process that we refined every time we had confirmed someone.
Yeah, I think it was a bit of a puzzle for sure. I think the only other person I can think of that was just like an unending correspondence that went nowhere was Frank Gehry, which at one point he seemed really interested, or someone who works for him seemed really interested in it, and then we could never close. So we moved on, but we're happy with where we ended up.
Thanks. A more technical question. Did you guys do all your transcribing and by hand? And you mentioned the Jane Thompson interview, which was 3.5 hours and a long time to transcribe. Did you do editing or logging of your interviews so that you wouldn't have to fully transcribe them? What was that part of the process?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think at the beginning we did that way. We transcribed Jane's full interview. We also had a lot of help on the book too. Lauren Palmer, who's a graduate of this program, assisted us. Mariel Suba, who was a assistant editor at Princeton Architectural Press. I can't think, we didn't actually use Rev ever, did we? We did in the end?
For the last two, we were just like, we can't do it, we just need to crank it out, so
Yeah.
we went to rev.com, which I think is like $1 a word, which is expensive, but it's a 1-day turnaround, so I think we
Yeah.
did splurge towards the end,
But yeah, it's
mostly had a lot of help.
I am always, I wish I could sort of timestamp and only take out the great parts. I'm always wanting to see everything so I can edit down and we could kind of evaluate what we wanted to keep and discard. And I think, as Aileen mentioned before, we were thinking of these sort of as oral histories too, so we kind of wanted to have a record of the interview, even if we didn't end up putting most of it in. Like in the case of Jane, where it's 18,000 words, and I think for each interview was around 2,000 words or so. So we have the raw transcripts, which maybe at some point we'll do something with, or.
And I think also transcribing the full thing, you kind of realize that transcribing itself you're essentially rewriting dialogue and trying to capture the tenor of how it was said. So I think for us, seeing it in full was really necessary. And in some cases, there were parts of narratives that had to be untangled a bit. Obviously when you're talking about a 60-year career, you get off on a lot of tangents. So, trying to highlight some of those and picking from different parts within the transcript It's a big process. I think a lot of people think interviews are the easier way to write, but it's just really another form of writing that often takes longer.
About a week ago, National Public Radio used the word in another context, geriatric guilt. And you also mentioned in your talk that at least one of the people mentioned that every generation has its own priorities. And this also sounds like it's primarily a feel-good book. Everybody's lauding these careers. Did any of the people you interviewed express regret or change of direction? In other words, certain architects pretty much made monuments